Hello, healers. My name is Ben, and this is the Moss Report. I'm here today with my father, author and founder of the Moss Report, Dr. Ralph W. Moss. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning, Ben.
So today, I understand we're going to be talking about tomatoes, which is appropriate. It is tomato season, and I'm super hopeful for some good news around this topic because it is sort of a ubiquitous food and something that I enjoy and eat all the time, as do many other people. So what can you tell us about the relationship of tomatoes with cancer or health more generally?
Well, I'm a pretty big critic of the standard American diet, but I think this is one of the things that's keeping the population, not just in the U.S., but many other countries, alive, because tomatoes, tomato sauce, tomato paste are very, very healthful foods, and they're commonly consumed, especially in things like pizza and spaghetti sauce and so forth. So this is one thing that the standard diet gets right, and that is to include tomato products, and specifically one chemical, that natural chemical that's found in tomatoes, include that in the diet.
I hear you mentioning things like pizza and so forth. I wonder how much healthful property can it have after all of that, processing into ketchup and tomato sauce and so forth?
Well, here's the weird thing. The amount of lycopene is greater in a processed tomato, that's to say a cooked tomato, especially if there's oil involved in processing it, than there is in fresh tomatoes.
Huh. That's kind of counterintuitive. One would always think, the fresh ingredient's going to give you the most healthful quality. Not so in tomatoes?
Well, there are other ingredients in tomatoes other than lycopene, so it's good to get fresh tomatoes as well. But if you're looking just for the lycopene, which is sort of the quote-unquote active ingredient in tomato, you actually get more by having it cooked, especially cooked with oil.
All right. Well, I'm assuming that you're not just saying this from personal experience. You have the science to back up what you're saying. I'm interested to see it. Is that something we want to get right into?
Well, yes, of course. I'm happy to get into it. A couple of points, though, that I want to make about lycopene. I've been giving, of course, a lot of thought to this. It's a strange thing that lycopene was more searched for, more on the public's mind, in other words, in 2005 than it is today. The amount of attention over the past 10 or 15 years has decreased by about 2/3. So the public and the scientific community, by the way, have sort of moved on when it didn't turn out to be a miracle cure for cancer or anything else. But when I look at the science of it, it's still very robust, very strong benefit to be had from eating tomato and tomato products. And I think it has, in many ways, fulfilled the promise that we saw almost 20 years ago, but the public hasn't caught up with this.
So were the studies in 2005 news back then? And is there developments to that story that you're going to catch us up on?
Yes. So there were positive things to be said in 2005, and it was all new to the public. It was the new thing. And then other things came to the fore. A lot of people are thinking about curcumin and other food components, and it's just the human nature that we're attracted to new things, shiny new things, but lycopene never really got the full attention that it deserves. But I'll show you some papers that are quite astounding, really, in terms of the health benefit of lycopene, which is also found in other foods, by the way. Other orange or reddish foods like watermelon and is another good source of lycopene. But for the average person, it's going to be tomatoes. And I want to talk also, if I can, about the different forms that tomato takes and how we can get this into our diet.
All right. That sounds good. So let's have a look at this first paper. Where does it come from? Who wrote it? And what does it say?
So this is a pretty famous paper. It's not specifically about lycopene, but it's about antioxidants and their effect on heart disease, on cancer, and on dying in general. And it comes from an institution I know quite well, Norwegian University of Science and Technology. I spent a week there once, very pleasant experience that I had, and also from many other groups, including Edward Giovannucci, who is a famous figure in American epidemiology, who's at the Harvard School of Public Health. So it comes from a very highly respected group, and from the American Society of Nutrition. And as I say, it's a very famous paper that is cited for many different things. It's not entirely about lycopene, but I've extracted for us the information that it gives about lycopene.
Okay, but let me ask you, it says dietary intake and blood concentrations of antioxidants. We haven't established, is lycopene an antioxidant?
It is an antioxidant, but we've learned over the past 20 years that many of these food substances that we initially thought of as working by their antioxidant potential, and meaning that they counteract free radicals or harmful chemicals that are generated in the body, that's only part of what they do. And so we've come to think about their effects of the antioxidants more broadly. And, you know, 20 years ago, I wrote a book called Antioxidants Against Cancer, and I don't have to retract anything that I said in that book, but we know so much more now about the many different ways that these compounds can work. They target cancer cells much more specifically than just fighting against free radicals, which is only one thing that they do.
That's interesting that the whole subject of antioxidants is still an evolving science. It's good to know.
This paper that we're discussing was a systematic review and a meta-analysis, and that's the highest level of proof within science. Maybe a higher level would be an umbrella review, which is a combination of all the meta-analyses. But a meta-analysis is a review of reviews, a study of studies. So it's a very high level of reliability to the study. And basically what it shows is, and I will quote, that the dietary intake or the blood concentration of carotenoids, which includes lycopene as one of them. These are things like you find in carrots. Did you say
carotenoids?
Carotenoids or carrot-like.
Carotenoids. Okay.
Right? Like beta-carotene. So they look at them all together. There's five or more of them, and they looked at them together, and they were inversely associated, meaning that the more you got of them, the less you had of these following diseases and conditions: coronary heart disease, stroke, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and or all-cause mortality, which means dying of any cause, just the fact of whether a person's alive or not at the end of the study. I will repeat that. Dietary intake and or blood concentration of these food factors found in colorful vegetables, carotenoids, is inversely associated, meaning it decreases the likelihood of heart disease, stroke, cancer, or dying. It's a meta-analysis of 69 other studies.
So 69 different studies specifically on the relationship of carotenoids and health.
Yes, correct. So I was drilling down here trying to get at the data on lycopene, and I'll move on, if you will, to the next page. And here is some that they looked at, a total of 69, as I said, prospective studies spread out over 99 different publications, because people break their findings up into different papers. So there's almost 100 papers on the topic that were included in this analysis, looking at antioxidant intake and coronary heart disease, stroke, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and mortality. And I'm going to move on again. And this is a chart. And basically, if you look at this, I'm not going to go into any great detail on this, but if you look at this, you see anything to the left of the vertical line indicates a decrease of dying or of getting these different conditions. And the size of the black box is the number of people included in this study. And you see that almost uniformly these things fall to the left of the line, meaning a reduction in the relative risk of the different things they're looking at: heart disease, cancer, and dying. That's a very strong, very well-established effect. This study just gives us a broad overview of the fact, the really no longer disputable fact, that getting these colorful vegetables and the compounds that are in and that make the vegetables colorful, like the lycopene in the tomato, is extremely important in terms of people's health. It's a pillar. Now, this was an interesting study, Ben. It was a study as part of what was called the Kuopio ischemic heart disease risk factor study, which isn't too important to us because we're not focusing on the heart benefit, although there is a heart benefit to lycopene. But of course, our focus is on cancer. But within this fairly large Finnish study from Finland from 2009, they were able to go back and then look at the specific question of serum, meaning blood levels of lycopene, and the risk of cancer.
Oh.
So this is rather important because it's one of the early studies on the relationship of lycopene specifically to cancer.
All right. May I ask a clarifying question about this paper then?
Yes.
So they originally started with a study around heart disease, but you're saying that when they did that, they also gathered other health data, including things that related to cancer, and then they went back and looked at that data and republished or published in a paper about the cancer risk that they found?
Right. Yes, exactly. Because these studies are expensive to run and difficult to run. So when you have a whole bunch of data, you can mine that data for other conditions and other factors, especially if you see a trend within the data that's pointing to something interesting, whether it's positive or negative.
Okay. And so what did they find?
So this study population was almost 1,000 middle-aged Finnish men, and they were looking again at the risk of heart disease. During the follow-up time, which was 12 and a half years, there were a total of 141 cancer cases that came about, of which 55 were prostate cancers. Elderly men are very prone to prostate cancer. And they say the association between the blood concentrations of lycopene and the risk of cancer was studied using traditional statistical models. And the result was an inverse association was observed between serum lycopene and overall cancer incidence. In other words, there was less cancer in people whose blood had more lycopene. That's all that means, a cancer incidence. Here's the sentence I think is very interesting. The adjusted risk ratio in the highest group for blood lycopene was 0.55, meaning there was a 45% reduction in the incidence of cancer among those who had a high level of lycopene. compared with the lowest level of lycopene.
Oh.
45% reduction. And for other cancers other than just prostate, there was an even greater reduction. It was 57%. This is high for any study, to put it mildly. But even for the studies involving lycopene, I just picked this one out of many studies that you could show. They all seem to show a benefit, but this one was an extraordinary benefit.
Wow.
About half the incidence of cancer in those who had a goodly amount of lycopene. And if you eat tomatoes, this goes into the blood. The lycopene shows up in the blood very, very quickly, actually. It's not it's not rocket science, you know. This is something that anyone can do, but these were individuals, some of whom obviously were eating tomato and tomato products, and some were not. And there was this, like, they reduced the incidence of cancer in half in the people who were eating tomato and tomato products.
Yeah.
The findings suggest that in middle-aged men, the higher circulating concentrations of lycopene may contribute to the lower risk of cancer, with the exception of prostate cancer. So this was it was odd too, in that they were looking for prostate cancer, and it wasn't statistically significant for prostate cancer, unlike some of the other studies that I'll show you, but it was highly significant for other cancers, which in a way is good, because if it only affected prostate cancer, then, you know, it would leave out at least half the population right there. But this is something that shows a profound effect on cancer in general.
Yeah, fantastic. I love those numbers.
Who wouldn't? And I want to talk about, I brought my little props with me. So I want to talk about different tomato products and what I think are the best ways to get this into your diet, because I have some very strong feelings about this, and what you shouldn't do vis-a-vis eating pizza and spaghetti and so forth. So we'll talk about that.
I wonder. I mean, they obviously they're looking at the blood to see the lycopene levels, and then they're extrapolating that. They're saying that there's a decrease in incidence of cancer.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that doesn't necessarily mean that the lycopene was having the anti-cancer effect, that it could be more of a dietary difference more broadly? So, for example, maybe people who tend to eat tomatoes also tend to eat more olive oil and garlic, and those things contribute to fewer incidents as well?
Absolutely. And we hear this all the time. Well, how do you know that it's the X, Y, or Z that's making it have the lower rates of cancer? Well, you don't know from any one study, because we know, of course, that correlation is not the same thing as causation. You can't say it's the lycopene or the tomatoes that cause them to have less cancer. All you can say is, in this study of middle-aged men, those who ate tomatoes also, coincidentally or not, had far less cancer. And it's probably not coincidental in the sense that it's not random, because these are studied statistically to make sure that they're fall below a 5% cutoff point of random chance. But we don't know that it's the lycopene causing this. And yes, you're right. People who eat tomatoes or tomato sauce have other characteristics to them as well. Maybe they're putting oregano on their food, and it's the oregano that has the effect. But there are so many studies, Ben, on these carotenoids, on the colorful vegetables, on lycopene, looking at it from different angles, and they all basically show variations on the same thing. So after a while, you get more and more confidence. When you see it happening over and over again in many different contexts, it gives you a lot of confidence that, oh, it probably is the lycopene that's causing it. But it's hard to be very explicit about it because there's always going to be possible glitches in any study. And that includes, by the way, randomized controlled trials, the so-called gold standard. There are problems with RCTs, randomized controlled trials, too. Strange things can happen, and you can criticize everything, and you should. But at the end of the day, I think the data here is very strong. I mean, and it's certainly actionable, which is another thing. We're not saying even to take a over-the-counter drug or something, not even saying to take a supplement, because we'll talk about that, but it isn't even necessary. The thing is that it's coming at us from so many different directions that I think my opinion is, my impression of looking at hundreds of studies, is that this is in fact a causative effect. There's something about the lycopene and its effect on cancer cells, which is any number of things, antioxidants being the first one discovered, but other things going on with cancer, that these natural chemicals attack the potential of the cancer cell to divide and to spread. And so we've got natural, quote unquote, drugs that our ancestors have been eating for thousands of years that actually have a big anti-cancer effect.
What else did you find in your research?
The title of this paper is Plasma Carotenoids and the Risk of Breast Cancer Over 20 Years of Follow-Up. The authors are from the Channing Division of Network Medicine, Department of Medicine, Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, one of the most famous hospitals in the United States, and Harvard Medical School. So very highly regarded scientists, and there's a lot of data in here that's all very fascinating. But basically, they start out by saying increasing evidence suggests that carotenoids, which are micronutrients in fruit and vegetables, reduce breast cancer risk. And then they want to look at whether early intake of these natural coloring agents in fruits and vegetables have an effect equal to or greater than late intake, meaning now you're worried about cancer, you're going to start eating a lot of fruits and vegetables. Is that going to be helpful, or is it something that you have to start early in life? So they did a special kind of study, and they measured using very high-tech techniques of the blood, on the blood, and it's part of the world-famous Nurses' Health Study that was they're still mining that huge database, 18,743 women who gave a second blood sample. They started out with 32,000 women, 33,000 women, and then about half of them gave further blood samples in order to be able to do this particular study. And the results were quite straightforward. Higher concentrations of beta-carotene and lycopene and some of the other colorful elements within fruits and vegetables were associated with between an 18% and a 28% statistically significant lower risk of breast cancer.
Yeah. That's fantastic.
Yes. And they break that down, by the way, what they mean by that 18 to 28%. The 28% was with beta-carotene, and for the lycopene, the amount was a little bit lower, but was also significant. So if you're going to take something, don't just think, oh, I'm just going to take lycopene. I mean, it's an argument for reorienting your diet towards the Mediterranean diet model to have a lot of nice, colorful fruits and vegetables. I think what makes the lycopene a bit different is that you want to have it cooked with olive oil in order to get the maximum benefit. Doesn't mean it's bad to eat a tomato, but it's better to eat a tomato with olive oil. But
do we have any sense of the quantities of tomatoes that people were eating, or we just know that they had the presence of lycopene in their blood to a certain level?
In this particular study, I think that's the blood level, which is more accurate in a way because it tells you, well, we can see it in the blood. We know that you ate the tomato, but it's all of these things are going to show up in the blood. And I'll show you, I have a paper where they actually measured the amount of lycopene in the blood in people who ate lycopene cooked in olive oil versus raw tomatoes.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll get
That'll
to that.
be interesting.
And here's some good news.
Well, that was good news.
Yeah, it's all good news, but it even gets better because the associations were apparent for total carotenoids measured 10 years or more before the diagnosis. That was from the first blood test that they took, where the reduction was 31%, but as well as those less than 10 years before the diagnosis, where the risk reduction was still 21%. So meaning, if you now are of an age where you're worrying about breast cancer, would it still pay to increase your intake of colorful fruits and vegetables and carotenoid? The answer is absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. You can start now, and it's still going to probably give you some benefit. We weren't able to look at it every day and every year, but looking at it from the point of view of more than 10 years or less than 10 years, it still was highly beneficial, even less than 10 years. So, of course, you want to do this as part of your lifestyle modification.
I guess I want to ask about bioavailability. I know this topic comes up sometimes when we are thinking about the way that we get nutrients, and in some cases it helps to have other substances in the bloodstream to help the body to absorb the nutrients. Is that something that you know about as it relates to lycopene and the other carotenoids?
We're having a minor disagreement here on the pronunciation. I'm not sure you're not right, but anyway,
okay.
But anyway, yes, I mean strongly yes. Strongly yes.
Okay.
And that is because, as I say, this has been studied with olive oil. And olive oil and tomatoes, of course, they go together beautifully, don't they, from the point of view of the human palate. And also in traditional Mediterranean cooking, I can't think of a meal I ever had in Italy where they served tomatoes and they didn't drizzle olive oil over it. And just on a personal note,
I'm getting hungry just thinking about it, honestly.
I made, and I can't eat too much in the way of tomatoes. I want to talk about that because of my type 2 diabetes, but yet I do buy tomatoes and I do eat them. And this morning I cut up a tomato, nice fresh vine ripened tomato, and I put it into a very ample portion of good Greek olive oil that I have and use, and I sauteed that in a pan, and then I added my eggs to that, and I made a tomato omelet. There was nothing other than some dried parsley. There was really not much more in that. So I practice what I preach. It isn't too hard to do because it's delicious. You know, it's just a wonderful treat. But I wouldn't eat tomatoes. I wouldn't waste the opportunity, let's put it that way, to eat tomatoes unless there's going to be some fat in the meal. And by far, the fat of choice is olive oil.
Well, I know this kind of comes up again and again about dosages. People really want to know how much to take because in some cases we've seen that there are diminishing returns past a certain point, like when we were discussing the topic of nuts and the significant benefit that they had past a handful, and the benefit sort of dropped off or even went in the opposite direction. And do we have any data on lycopene in terms of that type of information? Oh, okay,
I do.
Great.
And
Great.
it's the same thing. It starts to drop off with too much. So we'll get into that. Yeah.
Okay, I want to see.
I'll continue on, though.
I always get a little nervous that people are going to say, some things that they're talking about is good for you. I'm not going to eat a lot of it, and then overdoing it becomes an issue as well.
And there are some things that could actually be super dangerous to do that with. But this isn't that. You can overeat it. It doesn't fall off a cliff. The curve doesn't fall off a cliff. But there seems to be a diminishing return after a while. Yes, we'll get into this question of dose. I have some definite ideas about this.
Okay, great.
Here's a paper specifically on prostate cancer. Again, this comes from the Harvard School of Public Health, our perhaps most active epidemiological department in the United States. The corresponding author is Edward Giovannucci, who is a famous figure. The title of the paper is Dietary Lycopene, Angiogenesis, and Prostate Cancer, a prospective study in the prostate-specific antigen era, which is a mouthful.
What is angiogenesis? What does that refer to?
Blood vessel formation.
And that's something that cancer does actively, creates its own blood vessels and things. So they're looking at anti-angiogenesis properties in lycopene?
Correct.
Okay.
And angiogenesis is considered one of the 10 hallmarks of cancer, one of the 10 key characteristics of cancer.
Okay.
So they are looking at this. The paper dates from 2013. As I say, so much new material has come out about the key characteristics of cancer that angiogenesis has gone into the background a little bit, but it's still very important. And this was a study of almost 50,000 male health professionals. And they obtained dietary information through questionnaires and looked at total number of prostate cancer cases and deadly prostate cancer cases between 1986 and the end of January in 2010. The results, and I will quote, higher lycopene intake was inversely associated, meaning there was less of it, with total prostate cancer, and more strongly with lethal prostate cancer. The decrease was 28%.
Oh.
In a restricted population of the participants, meaning that they had a specific group in mind, the inverse association became markedly stronger. For lethal prostate cancer, the reduction was 53%, Ben. 53% reduction in the chance of dying of lethal prostate cancer.
Wow, that's amazing. 53% fewer instances of fatal prostate cancer.
Yes.
Among people who had a higher level of lycopene.
Yes.
Well, that's fantastic. That means that men who eat tomatoes are less likely to have fatal prostate cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So the big takeaway there is men should be eating lots of tomatoes.
Tomatoes with olive oil.
Mm-hmm.
The one little caveat here is when they compared the different measures of the dietary lycopene, early intake but not recent intake were inversely associated with prostate cancer. So in other words, you want to start this now. Start it yesterday, because it's not just something you're going to take a pill because you now found out that you have prostate cancer or you have aggressive prostate cancer and expect there to be any big effect. And any study that's done where they try to give men lycopene pills and then 28 days later they're going to do an operation on them, how likely is that going to be to have an effect? These things tend to work over time, just like the cancer developed over time. So even though in breast cancer, it does seem as if you start, even if you've only started within 10 years, it's still going to have an effect. But the point being, these are dietary changes, dietary maneuvers. It takes a while. It's not a treatment in the same sense that taking a anti-hormone shot is going to be a treatment, but it has a profound effect, profound effect. Higher lycopene intake was associated with biomarkers in the cancer indicative of less angiogenesis, because angiogenesis is a strong progression factor, okay? And it's relevant to the lethal prostate cancer. When you see a lot of angiogenesis, it's a sign that that cancer has legs, as it were, and could spread and develop new blood vessels, which gives it the chance to metastasize, to spread. So it's when you see this, and they did see less angiogenesis, fewer of the markers of angiogenesis in the people eating lycopene or had lycopene in the blood.
And I guess adults generally don't need to have angiogenesis going on to any great degree. I mean, the blood vessels are pretty well fully formed already as adults, right?
True.
So it's not as though something that's anti-angiogenic, if that's the right term, would adversely affect the health in some other way. At least I'm not interpreting that from what you're saying.
Well, at the level with lycopene, no. There are some drugs that have been developed, famous drugs that came out of Boston and Harvard that were quite toxic, but that's the difference between a food factor and a drug. The food factor works over a long period of time, and it's not toxic, not noticeably toxic. You don't see any harm. It's mostly benefit. But with drugs, it's a different story. You want to come up with a very powerful drug that's going to stop all new blood vessel formation. Yeah, you might do some damage in the body by doing that, but we don't have that fear because although at one time tomatoes were considered poisonous, but that was a long, long time ago, 250 years ago, they were considered poisonous. But nowadays we know that it's not harmful.
Is that because they are in that family of plants, the nightshade family?
Probably, yes. I don't know how that rumor got started that tomatoes were harmful, but it was thought at one time when people in the United States were not familiar with tomato plants that it was something poisonous. But you're right, there are negative side. Nightshade, it's related to nightshade, which is poisonous. So I think maybe that was the origin of this idea. But nobody's saying
but we don't see any of those toxic effects from nightshade-like factors in tomatoes.
We're bound to get some letters about this because some people do react negatively to tomatoes and nightshades. My mother was one of those. Your grandmother, she wouldn't eat tomatoes or eggplants or peppers because she says that she said that it swelled her arthritis. It made the arthritis worse. So there are people who do say this and do feel that this is what's going on for them, and I had no reason to doubt her. She was a very, very truthful person. So maybe there are other factors in tomatoes that some people would react to, but most people don't seem to have that problem.
Some people just have an aversion to them.
Right.
They just don't like them.
That's true. Maybe they have to take a supplement.
All right, what's this?
The title of this paper is a phase 2 study of docetaxel plus lycopene in metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer.
Ooh, okay. Sounds very specific.
Right. It comes from an institution you and I are very familiar with, University of California at Irvine, and they're very fine oncology department there. And it's about a drug, docetaxel, which is a standard treatment for advanced prostate cancer. I know the phrase castrate-resistant is going to be confusing to some people, but what it means is that the prostate cancer is oftentimes treated with hormonal drugs that counteract the male hormones, which are thought to accelerate the growth of the cancer. So if it's castrate-resistant, meaning that it is no longer responding to that type of drug. That's all that means. It's an advanced stage of prostate cancer. It's not responding to the normal way. So they give this drug, docetaxel, which is an interesting drug. It originally was derived from the Pacific yew tree, the bark, and then the leaves or the needles of the Pacific yew tree. And the drug is somewhat effective in terms of advanced prostate cancer. It's not a cure, but it is somewhat effective. So they wanted to take this standard drug used all over the world for this condition and add to it some lycopene and see what would happen. And they did.
And what did they find out?
It's a phase 2 study, meaning it's not a randomized trial. So they didn't, instead of randomizing, they compared it to another randomized trial, which was called TAX 237, so that they had a basis of comparison for the effect on the PSA, the prostate-specific antigen, and also the effect on the survival of the patient. So that's a less rigorous study than a randomized control trial, but still a very valid study, a phase 2 trial. The primary endpoint was looking for a greater than 50% reduction in the prostate-specific antigen, and other endpoints were the time to the PSA increasing, or the duration of the response, or the overall survival. 12 of the 13 patients had metastases. In the study, there was a PSA, or prostate-specific antigen, response rate of 76.9%, and in a standard study, it was 45%. The PSA, which is a sign of cancer growth in prostate cancer, was cut by about 1/3 the number of people whose cancers were progressing. But a bigger effect was seen in terms of survival, and that's going to be, of course, the most important thing to anybody who's dealing with this condition, because the median survival was 3 years compared to a little over 1 year for the people who were in the standard study. In other words, docetaxel without the lycopene. It was more than double the survival time. And that's very significant. It was a small study, but very, very suggestive that lycopene could be added to chemotherapy with big effects, even in this small study. It was 35.1 months for those who got the combination versus 17.4 months those who... So I overstated a little bit.
It's more than twice the length. Yeah.
Correct.
I almost lost the plot with how specific this study was. It almost felt like it didn't relate to cancer more broadly, but now I'm thinking that it actually does. If it has this benefit as an additive to chemo and can have that much of an effect. And as we've seen time and again, just because this has to do with a study around prostate cancer does not mean by any means that it wouldn't apply to other cancers as well. It just so happens that they were looking at it in this way.
Correct. It came out of the Department of Urology at UC Irvine. So it's a matter of opportunity. Sometimes maybe you have funding for a study in prostate or breast cancer. It doesn't mean that the other cancers wouldn't respond, but here we see a tremendous effect. And I'll point out that people will say, well, that's not a cure. They only lived 3 years. Yes, but we're just talking about one factor in a holistic way of viewing disease, health, and cancer. So we're not saying just take one thing. We give our information about olive oil, for instance. We're looking, scientists only look at one thing at a time, but we're holistic. We're thinking you have to change your way of life, and then you get the benefit of all these things together.
Well, I know we're not trying to get into recipes right at this moment, but when I think of tomatoes, I also think of parsley, I think of the olive oil, I think of garlic, all of which have tremendous health value, and some of which we've already discussed on other podcast episodes. So tomatoes slots right into our way of thinking about how we should be eating for our health.
Absolutely.
And this study, even as specific as it is an indication that it has value even under dire circumstances here.
Right. And these are dire circumstances.
Amazing.
It is. And this is, I didn't cherry pick these papers. I mean, I look, as always, I look for the most significant papers. Though, of course, I'm more interested in the positive studies than something that was maybe done less thoroughly, but you could always come up with a negative result if you want to, or just by error. But I'm looking at representative papers here, and this is what I'm seeing.
And it's so good that the UC Irvine department there are trying to use naturally derived substances in their protocols and studying the effects. I think that's fantastic.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful because
oftentimes we didn't see this. We did not see this even 10 years ago.
That's right.
Really. Right. So
very encouraged. Very encouraging.
And if this were something that was a patent drug, it would be already being used as standard of care,
well,
I would
certainly
think.
The drug industry would be fighting amongst themselves who could get their hands on this, and you'd be seeing multi-million, if not billion-dollar fights going on to monopolize it, and super high prices being put on this and so forth. It's the very accessibility and of this that makes it unattractive to the drug industry.
Right.
So this is so wonderful when you see an established medical department actually embrace at least the testing of a natural food-derived agent. It's we need 1,000 more studies like this, but I'll take it, whatever it is. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Now I see you got another paper here. This one looks interesting.
Right. And I can't tell you too much about the authors or about the journal, Asia Pacific Journal of Clinical Nutrition. It sounds okay.
It's a peer-reviewed journal, though, I'm assuming.
It's a peer-reviewed journal, and these people are at the University of Melbourne and some other places in Australia. But the reason I cited this is because it confirms what every Italian grandmother could tell you anyway, that tomatoes go very well with olive oil, and it can show you in scientific terms what the increase is. And here's a fantastic thing. The absorption of lycopene is greater from processed tomatoes than fresh tomatoes, since the processing breaks down the tomato cell walls and makes the lycopene more available. So they cooked the tomatoes with or without some extra virgin olive oil, just 25 milliliters, which I guess is like, maybe 1 tablespoon. And there was an 82% increase in the blood level of one form of lycopene and a 40% increase in the other form of lycopene in the 11 subjects, the 11 people who consumed tomatoes cooked in olive oil. There was no particular change in the 12 people who consumed tomatoes without the olive oil. We conclude that the addition of olive oil to diced tomatoes during cooking greatly increases the absorption of lycopene. The results highlight the importance of cuisine, i.e., how a food is prepared and consumed, in determining the bioavailability of dietary carotenoids such as lycopene.
So that's great, bioavailability.
The thing I'm most excited about, Ben, right now, and I'm sort of on a quest, and that is tomato paste.
Uh-huh.
It's cooked.
Okay.
It's highly concentrated to begin with. And this is double concentrated. There's something in the processing of it that they eliminate most of the water from it, I understand. And this is 100% Italian. And then I also have picked up this one, which is American organic. The Italian one is not organic. This one is. And it's also double concentrated. And I'm trying to figure out how much would constitute a standard dose. It's more than a teaspoon and less than a tablespoon. So in other words, what your daily intake would need to be in order to equal the amount that's given in the clinical trials would be a couple of teaspoons. Not much, really.
Mm-hmm.
You could easily get that.
Yeah. And you can cook it up and make a sauce out of it.
Or add it into add it into so many dishes. Mm-hmm. And the cooking won't hurt it. It's only going to make sure that you're going to get the benefit of it. If you're going to do a supplement, make sure it's derived from actual tomatoes and it's organic. But why not go for the food source?
And tomato sauce is a fantastic vehicle for being able to get all these other good cancer-fighting foods in the diet. Mushrooms, garlic, olive oil, parsley. I'm going to use tomato paste more, I think, now that I know that it's, as you said, it's been broken down more already. That's a good tip. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
Yes, one more tip for you. And that is that there is one form of tomato, one variety of tomato that I've read has twice as much lycopene as the average tomato. And that's called San Marzano, S-A-N-M-A-R-Z-A-N-O.
Yeah, it's familiar. They have those just in the regular tomato section at the store.
I saw that they have organic canned plum tomatoes, Cento, the big Italian brand of tomato sauces and paste, sell this. It's a little harder to come by than most and a little more expensive, but these are organic and they're also the kind of tomato that apparently has twice as much lycopene as the normal tomato.
That's fantastic. That's a great tip. I'm going to only get those from now on.
Me too.
But for now, for the Moss Report, I'm Ben Moss. How are you healing today? Thank you for watching. We really appreciate all of the support. Please leave a like, a comment, subscribe to the channel, and visit themossreport.com. We wish you all the best for health and healing.